like to call this meeting of the Architectural Design and Planning Commission to order. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Ready? Begin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Roll call, please.
Commissioners Angela Hearns.
Present.
Commissioners Andrew Mercy.
Here.
Commissioner Timothy Wiley.
Present.
Chairperson April Bartlett.
Present.
We have a quorum.
Public business from the floor. If an individual is unable to stay through the entire meeting due to extenuating circumstances, a total of 10 minutes is provided at this time, during which input may be given regarding agenda items. Individual speakers are limited to 3 minutes each. Any person who would like to address the Architectural and Design Commission on any agendized item is requested to complete a speaker card for the recording secretary and identify the agenda item you would like to discuss. Each person will be given an opportunity to address the Architectural and Design Commission at the time such item is discussed by the Architectural and Design Commission. Speaker cards available at the entrance of the council chambers. Individual speakers are limited to 3 minutes each. So we'll move on to the consent calendar. Okay. I move that we approve the minutes from the regular meeting of February 2nd. Give me a second.
A second.
Motion is approved.
Yes. Motion passes 4-0.
Okay. New business. Let's see, the draft master plan of complete streets. The recommendation is to receive presentation and testimony on the draft master plan of complete streets for consideration in the Commission's review of the plan. It's anticipated the Commission will take action on the proposed plan at the regular meeting of May 4th, 2017, or as soon thereafter as the Commission deems appropriate to take action. Our presenter is Brian Luedecke.
Thank you, Commissioners. I'm really happy to be standing in front of you with this. We've been talking about this for a couple of years, I think, and we're finally now in position to begin the public review of the draft document. So I did prepare a staff report. My goal in this presentation is to kind of introduce you to the concepts and ideas behind the plan, what we're trying to achieve with the plan. As I indicated, we're not really intending that you take any action on this evening. This is really your introduction. We did provide you a link to the plan itself. I'm sure you will enjoy all 200 and some odd pages of it if you get the chance to look through all of it, some of its appendices. But I think along with the staff report, this will help guide perhaps some of your review into the key things that we're looking at doing. And I don't want to minimize that we are looking at what I consider to be a pretty fundamental shift in the way we look at our street design and the way we evaluate what our streets are doing. Because for decades, the city of Lancaster, as most cities in the United States, has only looked at street design from one perspective. And we've begun looking at it from varied ones, including, as you may recall, people who were on the commission at the time. With the start of the Master Plan of Trails and Bikeways, that was one of the real starting points for shifting our thinking. And we think that what we're looking at here is very, very important in putting into place the policies and approaches that we need to continue that kind of effort. So I'm going to start with a real simple question. And I'm not a traffic engineer. I'm a planner. So my way of looking at this may be a little more simple than perhaps someone who's more technically gifted in this, but it's the way that I kind of understand it, and I hope that will help you also. So we'll start with a real simple question, and the real simple question is, Are these two streets the same? This one and that one. Are those streets the same? My guess as you look at them is you're going to say no, they're not. But there is something about them that is the same. And I think that's at the heart of part of what we're looking at doing with this overall plan. The one on the left, by the way, is in downtown Fort Collins, Colorado. The one on the right, which some of you may readily recognize, is Avenue L, just to the east of its intersection with 10th Street West. So to help you think about what's the same and what's different about those two streets that you saw, this is Lancaster Boulevard in 2009, before we redid it. Included on this are the dimensions of that street at that time. That was the street afterwards. Now the thing that you'll find is that the width or the right-of-way of that street has not changed. What has changed is the allocation of the space within that right-of-way, how that space in that right-of-way is used. Rather than having 4 travel lanes, it now has 2. Rather than having perhaps not as much landscaping, there's now much more. There wasn't parking down the center of it, there is now. So the difference is not the width or the right-of-way, but how the city chose to allocate the space within that street. And if going back to the previous example, that street that you saw in Fort Collins and Avenue L had the exact same right-of-way, but they are far different in the way that their space is allocated. And that's important. The key thing that we are looking at in the master plan of complete streets is that streets ought to be designed for the context that they're in and the function that we want them to perform. And that may seem straightforward and that may seem like it makes a lot of sense, but that is not the way we have always approached it. So as we look at our master plan of complete streets, there are some really key concepts within it. The first, as I mentioned, streets serve complex needs. So they have to be designed on a contextual basis. They really can't be designed with a one-size-fits-all approach. What's appropriate in one area of the city is not in another. We have to recognize also that streets, like the city, like neighborhoods, like various corridors, are going to evolve and change over time. We need to make sure that our planning work and our design factors allow for those changes to occur. You've seen that happen on several of our streets within the city already. The way that they were 10 years ago is not the way they are now. You're going to see more of that. And the reason is because they are evolving and changing to meet needs that are changing. Different demands, different users. This is really key, particularly from an economic standpoint. If our streets are not adaptable and resilient, meaning that they can serve multiple needs, then the city ultimately is not adaptable and resilient because our streets are the single largest piece of property that the city owns. Our right-of-ways far exceed whatever our parks are, our public buildings are, or anything else. The largest amount of property that we hold as a city, as a public entity, is our street rights-of-way. Nothing else is larger. And the city has to be the final authority on how street design, and how the public right-of-way is allocated. And that also seems like it ought to be a simple concept, but believe me, there are a lot of people around and a lot of agencies who would like to tell us how our streets ought to be designed and how they ought to function. But we, the city, are the ones who take the liability. We do the maintenance. We are responsible for fixing them, repairing them, handling anything that happens within them. So we are logically the agency that should be dealing with them. We really are looking at a different approach. And that different approach relies on the idea that human behavior, which is the ultimate thing that governs the traffic engineering profession, is fundamentally adaptable. In other words, you can change the way people behave. You can change the way that they function in a space by changing that space. There are a lot of people who've talked to this. Hans Monderman passed away now, but he was a Dutch traffic engineer. And he was really one of the proponents of what was known as shared space. And he had a very good quote that I think is important. He says, "Every road tells a story, but it's just that many of our roads tell the story poorly or tell the wrong story." And what he's alluding to is that as a driver or as a user of a street, whether you're a pedestrian, a transit user, a motorist, you take cues from the design of that street, and that street tells you how you ought to behave and act. And what we do in a lot of cases is we want people to behave one way, but our design tells them to behave another. And that's one of the things that we really need to look at. I like the Strong Towns meme. You know, if you need a sign to tell people to slow down, you wanted them to drive more slowly, well, you designed your street wrong. Something is not right about the design of the street. Why are we wanting to go this way? Well, one of the things that's very much of a concern to us as a city, and it has become much more of a concern over the last few years, is the safety issue on our streets. And there's a lot of different ways to measure that. One of the ways you can measure that is in your fatalities per 100,000 population. Now, it's not necessarily the only way you can look at it, but it certainly is one way. And since we as a city love to compare ourselves with other cities in the world, I found this to be really interesting, this information that I found. So if you're in Stockholm, well, 0.7 per 100,000 is the fatality rate in Stockholm. Not a place exactly known for great weather or, you know, sunny days. If you're in Paris, it's 1.7. If you're in San Francisco, it's 3.4. If you're in Los Angeles, which has its own level of problems, it's 6.3. Atlanta, very car-centric area, 9.7. Sao Paulo, Brazil, is 11.8. Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam is 13.1. There we are, 14.1 in 2015. But we were at least a little better than Johannesburg, South Africa. So what does that tell us? It tells us that how our streets are laid out, the things that we're doing are creating, in many ways, a very dangerous situation. When we interviewed several stakeholder groups as part of this effort, one of those was the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, and we asked the officer that we interviewed, we said, why are there so many problems? What's the cause of all of this? And he didn't speak so much to design, but he said it's almost always speed plus something, speed plus inattention, speed plus impairment, speed plus distraction, something of that type. So, but he kept coming back to the issue of speed. By the way, the source for this, you can find it online, is Cities Safer by Design from the World Resources Institute. As we look at the Master Plan of Complete Streets, we have priorities that we have proposed for our street design. And the first one is safety, that whatever street we design, it ought to be safe to the extent that it can be made that for all expected users, motorists, pedestrians, bicyclists, transit users. We have a very, very deep interest in cost, both the initial cost of the facility and in the long-term maintenance. That, in fact, is becoming more and more of an issue in our city. You're aware of the city's Revive 25 program. That's a concerted effort to try to get out and address some of the maintenance issues that exist in our city streets. But we also believe that in the design of those streets, we need to look ahead and make sure that what we're doing is a productive type street. In other words, what we get back in terms of public revenues that the street helps create ought to be enough to cover the cost of that maintenance and that operation. Traffic volume and capacity and traffic speed. But on the sense that speed really ought to be adapted to meet our other values and objectives. It's not a primary goal in and of itself, and therefore it shouldn't guide everything else that we do. So what are some of our important considerations? Well, one we're going to talk about, And I think this is a very important discussion, is mobility, what I call mobility versus accessibility. That's a problem in our city. It's a problem in many places in the United States. Emergency access. We have to make sure that emergency providers, emergency responders, have the ability to get to where they need to go. Street networks. We need to consider the networks of our streets, not just simply an individual street design, because people use networks of streets. Trade-offs. The fact is, if you design a street to do more of one thing, it's probably going to do less of another. And what you really need to do is be able to understand that and be able to be ready to accept what those trade-offs are. But they have to be looked at. We recognize that streets are part of the overall design of the city. I think going back to the Boulevard example, if you think about how the street looked in 2009 and how it looks now, it's a far different place because of the design of the street, something that we need to always keep in mind. And finally, the evaluation of street performance, which is changing quite radically in the state of California. So our plan, along with some of the changes in our general plan, propose to bring those changes into our own city documentation and guiding documents. Design really matters. This is from a group known as Strong Towns, and what they look at, and this is going to get into this issue of mobility and accessibility, is that streets that are designed for really slow speeds and have people on them, they're pretty safe. If you look at the Boulevard, it's a relatively safe place to be if you're a driver or a pedestrian. If you are a traveler on a freeway, it's designed for high speed. It's designed to take you quickly to where you need to go. So it's considered safe. It's that middle area where we have most of our problems and where most of our concerns come from when we look at street design in the city. It says deadly. Yeah, it's very deadly. So when we look at mobility and accessibility, this is mobility. This is designed to take you quickly from one place to another. And it's pretty simple if you look at it. I mean, I don't mean that someone could design it in a day, but it's a relatively simple facility. The traffic on one side all goes one direction. There are no traffic signals. There are no driveways. There's no one probably unexpectedly pulling in front of you. There's no one unexpectedly probably slowing down to turn into a driveway. There's no one turning left in front of you. It's a relatively simple facility. But we don't deal with this much in the city. We deal with streets, and they're complex. They're complex because they serve multiple users. They serve motorists, they serve pedestrians, they serve bicyclists. And that means that they have to be looked at differently than that high-speed highway or that high-speed freeway. That confusion between mobility and accessibility, as I call it, because local streets are really designed to be accessibility streets, is where we get a lot of our issues from design. And streets have always been complex. They were complex in Brainerd, Minnesota in the early, yes?
May I ask a question?
Sure.
Just for clarity. I'm thinking maybe concretely, so I need your input. So when you say accessibility, does that mean to get to these streets?
It actually means to get from that street to the land use adjacent to it.
Okay. Okay.
That's what we're really looking at. How well does that street serve the adjacent land use along it? If you think of a residential street, for example, that's its primary function. Although you can travel along it, its primary job is to get you to your house, or to get you to your friend's house, or to get you to your driveway. That's its primary job.
Okay.
As opposed to the Antelope Valley Freeway, which won't get you to your house at all.
No.
It's not designed to.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Yes. The complexity, and you can see in Brainerd, Minnesota, you can see in Lancaster in the 1920s, you can see the mix of people in the street and vehicles. This had horse-drawn wagons, and it goes back further than that. That's Pompeii. If you know anything about Roman design in Pompeii, those stepping stones were actually so pedestrians could get across the street. The chariots and the carts had to align their wheels to go through them. So early traffic calming and early pedestrian accessibility. There you go. So we're not new at this. This has been going on for thousands of years. So on our question, and this gets back to the one thing that we were talking about, this is Avenue K, if you're familiar with it, just a little west of 10th Street West. So the question is this designed to provide mobility or accessibility? Now, I shared this picture with a friend of mine, and I said, do you think this is a good picture? And his comment, he said, well, the problem isn't either of those, it's just that it's not very attractive. So I said, okay, there. Same question. This happens to be on 10th Street West, south of Rancho Vista Boulevard. Mobility or accessibility. And actually, it tries to do both. It tries to provide mobility. In fact, as a driver, when you see this street and it isn't clogged with vehicles, what's your initial thought? How fast can you go down it? Probably as fast as you think you can to beat the traffic light that's at the end, yes. But if you are someone trying to get to the adjacent land use, tell me how much fun it is to make that left turn across 3 lanes of traffic. Yeah, if you're like me, you will figure ways around that so you don't have to make that movement. So what you have is something that doesn't do either of those things very well. That's where the real safety kinds of concerns come in. It's too high speed to be safe for accessibility, but because of the number of traffic circles and traffic signals and conflicting movements in driveways, it also is not a very pleasant experience to try to get somewhere down if your destination isn't right here. It is, and this is actually a word now in the online Urban Dictionary, it is what's known as a STROD. It is a street road hybrid. It is referred to by one particular civil engineer as the futon of transportation investments. You know, a futon, as we know, is an uncomfortable couch that becomes an uncomfortable bed. And the point is that it tries to do 2 things and it doesn't do either one of them very well. Oftentimes, these things, that's the actual online definition, by the way. This is not in our city. This is in Santa Clarita. That's Soledad Canyon Road, which has got the same particular issues. One of the things that I think is really unique about this is the statement, unsafe at any speed. And I think we can all think about that. It's unsafe when you're driving it at 45 or 50 because you're always wondering who's going to be turning or making a movement. But if you're also like me and you have to turn into that driveway and you slow down to 10 miles an hour, I'm always looking in my rearview mirror for who might be coming behind me. It's a very difficult facility, and because of the things that we have to place into it, traffic signals, medians, things of that type, it's a very expensive facility. So that speed is really, really important because, as you can see, at 20 miles an hour, and if you're a pedestrian and you get hit by a car, you are going to get injured, but you probably won't die. If you get hit at 40 miles an hour, odds are you're going to die. In fact, even the slightest differences in these speeds can matter. I found this very interesting. Someone was online where they said if you have a car that's going 30 miles an hour and you have a pedestrian that enters the street 45 feet away, you can stop in time. You will not hit that pedestrian. But if you're going 35, you're still going to be going 18 miles an hour when you reach where that pedestrian is located 45 feet away. So even that slight difference makes a big difference in terms of stopping distance and other things. So as the traffic officer said to us, speed is a big deal. it's a major factor in collisions, and the thing that they find the most frequent in terms of causes. Let's talk a little bit about emergency response. We had a really good conversation with representatives from the LA County Fire Department in terms of what do you need, what are we looking at, and one of the things that they don't think about a lot, but they are affected by, is the idea of street networks. One of the reasons for that is that the fire code doesn't think about them either. It thinks about the width of an individual street and whether you can get equipment down it. But one of the things that, and one of the people that we talked to really kind of laughed about this, because this has actually happened. You may be familiar, 20th Street East and K4, this is a fire station located south of Avenue K there. And so we looked at the issue of what would happen if you had to get to that house where that green triangle is located. That's actually about a quarter of a mile away from the station, but because of the way the street network is, which is chopped up and not continuous, that's the travel route to it. It actually takes a little more than a mile to get to that facility or to get to that house from that fire station if you had to, even though it's only a quarter mile away. And the gentleman kind of laughed, as I said, because he said that's actually happened. In fact, we got lost getting there because we didn't know how to quite get through all of the chicanes. So when we think about our emergency access, networks are important and those connections are important. Once again, quarter of a mile, but a mile's worth of driving for a fire engine, including, as you can see, 1, 2, 3 left turns, which, as any traffic engineer will tell you, are the most difficult turns. Actually, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Those are the most difficult ones you can make because you have to cross opposing traffic. Street networks are also important as we look over the long term for creating better walking opportunities, better bicycling opportunities, because those connections increase the amount of area that you can cover in a 5-minute walk, which is the typical way of looking at it. One of the things that we're also very concerned about, I mentioned productivity and how streets can be productive. This is, once again, the picture you saw before. That's Brainerd, Minnesota, back in the late 1800s. This is Brainerd, Minnesota on that very same street today. And you can see how much was going on that street versus what's happening there now. And the message there is you have a lot of infrastructure here, very expensive. You have not only the street, but whatever utility systems are there, and your tax base to support it is almost non-existent. So you have to really consider those kinds of things when you look at how streets are designed and what is the intended use along them. We had our own example. We had a pretty productive street in the early 1920s on Lancaster Boulevard. We didn't have such a productive one by March of 2010, but we got one back. And the nice thing about it is it's continuing to do that. As more development occurs along it, as more things happen, it becomes a more productive street and more investment comes back into it. That's exactly what you want to have happen in those kinds of settings. We know from our own work that complete streets improve safety. Valley Central Way is I still think our shining example of that. It's a relatively inexpensive thing. It's paint. That's what we used. But we got reductions in speed. We got reductions in the number of collisions. When you look at return on investment, that's a pretty good deal. And of course, there's various techniques that our plan calls out that we can use. Those include bulb outs. Those are not only good at shortening pedestrian crossing distance, but they help slow vehicles. They can't turn the corner at 50 miles an hour. They have to pay attention to what's going on. Neighborhood traffic circles, as they're called, these are not roundabouts. They're kind of a little cousin to those. We are actually looking in some places at that. And This is something I hope we'll try at some point. We have a number of different bike lane configurations that we're looking. This one I particularly like because it actually places the parking between the moving vehicles and the bike lane. That does two great things. Number one, you don't have the traffic whizzing by you as a bicyclist. Number two, you don't have the unfortunate possibility that someone's going to open their car door just as you reach that location. I thought this was a drawing that I thought was really good at illustrating some of the things that we're going to be looking at. Those include the idea that on-street parking can go back on some of our streets. That may be a very important thing to some of those businesses and those tenants along those streets. The bicycle lanes, where we can accommodate them and have planned for them in our master plan of trails and bikeways. One of the things that we've also learned is that if you narrow travel lanes, you slow down traffic. People drive more slowly where you have a narrowed lane. Once again, just paint, but psychologically they feel a little more constrained and they drive more slowly. Final thing that I really want to talk about, and it's a very important part of the plan, is this idea of revising how we look at the performance of streets. The current way that we look at it, and the way we've looked at it for years, is what's known as a vehicular level of service, LOS. The idea of this is that it really it uses vehicle delay as a way to evaluate how well your street is working. The problem with that is it doesn't measure anything else. It measures that vehicle delay. It doesn't really consider productivity or economic issues, and it is now eliminated as a consideration under the California Environmental Quality Act. Cities can still use it. In fact, as you'll see, we're still proposing to keep it, but it is no longer something that works its way into the environmental discussion. And that's important because the way the California Environmental Quality Act is set up, if you have something that becomes a significant effect, you either have to mitigate it or you have to override it on overriding considerations. So by having that taken out, it gives us a lot more flexibility on what we can do. In case you're wondering, the state is really moving towards this vehicle miles traveled as the environmental metric for things. Vehicle miles traveled. In other words, the idea that you should really be looking at how you can reduce vehicle travel, air emissions from that, and so forth. That's a better metric to look at than, vehicle delay. What we're proposing are variable metrics, things that we can look at in many cases qualitatively. Now, I should say LOS is actually also a qualitative measure, but what we're looking at are different things that we can use to determine how well our streets are working, but based upon factors that we think are important. That may include what's known as a multimodal level of service. That has some of its own limitations, but is certainly one thing that we will consider. Speed of vehicles, as I said, is a very important factor. Needs of adjacent land use. Do you need to if you take out a row of parking so you get another travel lane, does that adversely affect those businesses that are along there? We need to be able to make those judgments as a city. And of course, pedestrian and bicyclist safety and accessibility also. So what we would have in the general plan is actually dual ways of measuring. The first is for what we define as our infill area, or the urban core. This is actually contained in our zoning code right now. So for development or streets that are in those areas, we would possibly accept during peak hour a vehicular level of service that's less than D. Once you get past D, that's where you start getting into issues of breakdown, multiple cycles through intersections and so forth. But we are also going to write a little bit of a limitation for ourselves, which says that we can't mitigate that solely on the basis of vehicular measurement. In other words, we're not going to simply mitigate something because that level of service reading is as, at D or worse. In other words, we're going to consider other factors, and we have to actually have another one that calls out why we should make that change, whether it's safety or whatever.
Would an example of that be what you're talking about at the college? Whereas the level of service would be the people that need to get to the college, but then the pedestrians and the surrounding
Right.
areas.
Yes, yeah.
That's a pretty bad corner there, isn't it, K and 30th?
Yes, it is. But that's a good example. And why are we looking at doing that? Well, it recognizes that in this core area, we have denser and more mixed development. And we really want the ability to allow those kinds of projects to go forward. We want the ability to allow more investment in our core area. We want to improve the walking and biking environment, and we don't want to have to be in a situation where we have to widen a street or widen an intersection simply because a level of service calls it out. But in the other areas that are the outlying areas of town, which in many cases have been built on a different model, a different system, we're basically going to keep the LOS type of approach. Should generally be D or better during peak hour. But we have given ourselves the ability to evaluate whether a mitigation of an impact would cause problems in meeting other objectives. For example, we may need to widen an intersection, but in widening that intersection, we may increase the crossing distance for school children, which causes, signal timing and, of course, safety concerns. So we want the ability to be able to weigh those kinds of factors rather than simply say, okay, that's what the LOS service says, that's what we're going to do. It seems like they may be about the same, but they're actually a little more nuanced than that. There is a distinct difference between what we're proposing to do in the core and what we're looking at doing in the outlying area. And my final comment is, why do we need to make these changes? Because they're quite significant if you look at the draft changes in the general plan. Well, first, we have to provide a clear statement of what our approach is to street design and support of the Complete Streets approach. We want to make sure that the plan calls out that our master plan of complete streets, once it's adopted, is the city's street design planning document. That's what we're going to use, and that's where we're going to go to make our decisions. We need to make sure that we establish the legal and policy basis for the design flexibility that we want. If you don't have that called out in your general plan, it's always subject to question. We want to give the maximum flexibility that we can to our engineers, our street designers, to make sure that we can solve the problems that we view as problems, not what somebody else thinks may be problems. And finally, I mentioned that the state and other agencies are going in a far different direction recently on street evaluation and how you look at things. The state of California, obviously, as I mentioned, has taken vehicular LOS out of its role in the environmental process. The Southern California Association of Governments, through many of its planning and policy initiatives, are going the same way. They want more mixed use, more dense development possible. So one of the ways you do that is you allow those things to occur without worrying as much about what the immediate effect on the street system is. You measure it in different ways. And also, one of our major funding organizations, the Los Angeles County Metropolitan Transportation Authority, is now requiring that cities have to have a complete streets policy or approach in order to qualify for funding. So we have a lot of things that are driving us from the outside as well as the internal concerns that we have to look at this plan. That's a lot. and I'll try to answer any questions that you may have. If they get on the more technical side, then I may refer them to our engineer.
Is there a built-in cost savings in there? I mean, I know it costs to kind of rearrange the streets, but because they're safer and everything, is that like an inherent cost savings to the cities also because there's less of negative activity that would take place? Is that
Well, certainly if you reduce the number of collisions, you
Okay.
reduce the amount of demand on city staff, replacement of equipment and so forth. Your point's really good, because I think one of the biggest challenges that the city is going to face over the next decade is not so much how it builds new streets, but how it plans the ones it's got, how it allocates space within those and thinks through that network. I believe that's where the challenge is really going to be. And I believe that this plan helps set up the proper framework for the evaluation and meeting that challenge.
okay? Because that was the other part when I saw that that puzzle, which takes a 2-day ride around a quarter mile. That, you know, you say, well, why don't we just kind of break the wall down and go through? But
Yeah.
you know, then you save a life, which, you know, to me is a tremendous cost savings. But at the same time, you know, what is the cost of restructuring all that, if possible, or
Right.
if at all? I mean, it's been there, so it may not.
Yeah, that's why you really have to do the networks right at the start, to make sure that you get the connections you need at the start. Because to go back in, it's one thing to go in and kind of reallocate space on a street. I don't want to say it's without political concern, but it's a lot easier to do. You want to take 5 lanes and turn it into 3 with bike lanes, it's a relatively simple process. But to go to somebody and say, you know, that cul-de-sac you've lived at the end of, it's going away.
Going
We're
away.
going to connect it across so that in the event that emergency access needs to come, you can get there. Much harder issue to address.
Thank you.
So the, forgive me if I say the wrong name, the Revive 25, is that what it's called?
Yes,
That's going to work in conjunction with this as the streets are being repaired? Is that going to be working in conjunction with putting in the new lanes and
yes, actually, even in places where we've already identified in our master plan of trails and bikeways where bicycle lanes, buffered bike lanes, things of that type, yes, we try to make sure that we get those done if there's a major repaving project or something of that type. Yes.
Are there any streets in the city that are county property, or are they all?
There are streets that are shared at our boundaries in some cases. We share streets with the city of Palmdale. We share streets with the county of Los Angeles in some areas.
With that said, is there a responsibility that each participant has, or is there a networking or coming together that says, okay, well, you're going to be responsible for that huge pothole, or we're going to be responsible? Who takes the responsibility for those shared streets?
I'm going to let Trelise answer that question. He
Okay.
may have a better way to express it than I would.
Typically, the agency that has ownership of their half of the street will do the maintenance of that street. So if it's a shared street and the boundary line is down the middle, we would take care of the side that falls in the city of Lancaster. County would take care of the other side. Sometimes we enter into agreements with those agencies, in particular with the intersection maintenance, signal maintenance. So where we have shared signals, we'll often enter into a maintenance agreement with them where we outline who's going to maintain it, how we're going to pay for it, and those types of things.
Okay, good to know.
One other thing I'll just kind of allude to, too, and we run into this and are running into this a little more frequently. Because we've kind of shifted our approach to our streets and our thinking on streets, we're not always in alignment with our adjacent agencies on how they look at how they think the street ought to be and how we look at it. So that's also an area of dialogue that I think we're going to have to engage in a little more frequently now.
Okay.
Is there a first priority of streets that we're looking at? I got one in my own mind. You're like
Well, if you have one, we'll listen.
Avenue K. It has and I never understood that. Ever since I lived there, it was like, I guess you could go 55 there from 30th Street East. Before they put the traffic light there, or actually down to 40th Street East, going forward. And the traffic light slows you down somewhat, but when I see the new design, I can see how it could really make a better flow and slow the traffic down. I mean, because people still go 75 there on occasions.
Yeah.
Not me included, but
Yeah, it would be wonderful. I mean, in a perfect world, what you'd want is slower speed, but more steady flow.
more city
Because
flow.
as you've just kind of alluded to yourself, I'm sure you can think about, okay, I went 55 and now I stop at the light and I have to wait, and then I have to,
Yeah.
and that's one of the things where, well, if you could go 30 or 35, but you could make it through the intersections
Section.
more easily, that would be,
Yes.
you could, in theory, take the same amount of time or even less and
Right.
still make a safer situation.
Okay.
Yeah, how is that taken into consideration, the, I guess, the length of time that travel time that it affects? I'll give you an example. I went from 45th West on Avenue K out to 70th East on Avenue K a week or two ago, and it takes a long time. As we kind of try these new things to improve safety, how do we take into account, again, that, making things smoother and take into account drive time and commuters and all of that?
Yeah, there's different ways you can look at approaching that, but I'm glad you brought that up because we talked about this mobility versus accessibility approach. One of the reasons that streets in cities are really more for accessibility is that it's almost impossible to keep them as high mobility streets. If you think about Avenue L and how it was, say, 15 years ago, before the traffic signal for Costco and the traffic signal in 10th and now the traffic signal at Kaiser and so forth. Keeping that mobility aspect of it is much more difficult, and I think things just over time tend to be more towards the accessibility side. As far as different approaches, roundabouts are more of a continuous type flow. They're appropriate in some locations. In certain types of corridors, and we'll be looking at this also as a city, you can do adaptive types of signal approaches, which try to sense the amount of flow of traffic and try to reduce delay and adjust over the day to address that. So there's different ways, but ultimately, where you have more complexity, more people crossing, more driveways, more things like this, the ability to keep that mobility gets less and less, and the issue of accessibility becomes the key. I have a friend that lives out in, I think it's actually west of Quartz Hill, but it's out 70th, 75th. And when he moved out there, he complained to me about how long it took to drive into town. And I said, yeah, well, you know what? It's never going to get any shorter because as you get more development and you get more things that happen, you have more delays. It's just kind of inherent in it. Yeah, I told him, actually you're driving the same distance as it goes from Encino to Burbank. Which he said, no, it's not. Yes, it is. But you don't perceive it as that because you don't have the same level of delay.
The other thing I get is the outlier traffic. You saying it going out those distances. What tends to happen is people go, it's maybe 60 they're supposed to, but maybe faster, and they refuse to stop. That's one of my big concerns. But they bring that 65-mile-an-hour traffic into, as we've kind of expanded. I see that like coming. You come in, and so you continue to have a mindset of high speed. And then even though there's a traffic sign, a stop sign, they still continue with that. Is there thought as far as doing the outlier in or just kind of building the
Well, I think
Building it back out to that.
now, I think one of our underlying, you don't control people's speed with speed limits.
Right, yeah.
Especially the way the state of California sets them. But what we're hoping is that through the design of the streets, the design of the street itself is going to be the thing that slows people. But
Okay.
you bring up a real good point. We talked about the freeway. 65 miles an hour on a freeway is fine. But 65 miles an hour where there are signals and turning and everything else is extremely dangerous. So as I was reading one civil engineer's writing about that kind of thing, and he said, I'm kind of tired of hearing it called accidents because I consider that they are the statistically inevitable outcome of combining all of these things. Sooner or later someone's going to make a misjudgment or something's going to happen. So.
Okay, thank you.
I have to say, I definitely am a fan of the protected bike lanes, just for the main reason, kids. I mean, adults, are more aware of their surroundings, but you can't take kids out in the bike lanes if they're not protected because, they tend to swerve around a little, and you don't want a car anywhere near them. So I think that those are a great idea.
Yeah, where we can get those installed, I certainly think that we'll make that effort.
Near the schools would be fantastic, and with those bulb outs, with the curbing to give them less crossing, those are all such great ideas. I'm looking forward to seeing those all implemented.
Okay. Well, you have the document available to you via the FTP site, so take the time and go through it, and if you have questions, feel free to email us or call as you go through your review. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all your hard work, everyone. So we will move to public business from the floor, non-agendized items. No? Okay. This portion of the agenda allows an individual the opportunity to address the commission on any subject regarding city business. Under state legislation, no action be taken on non-agenda items. Members of the public should be aware of this when addressing the commission regarding items not specifically referenced on the agenda. Please complete a speaker card for the recording secretary. Individual speakers are limited to 3 minutes each. All right.
She can speak now if she wishes.
Did you want to speak? We're adjourning the meeting unless you need to.
What I would like to say is I'm just up here as a concerned person, and it may look on the surface of the streets like everything's okay in most places, but below the surface things are not good, and it's a pretty ugly situation out there. We're at the point now where it's like continuously day after day. It's somebody dying. It's sirens continuously, people getting hurt constantly. And if we don't do something about this, we're not going to survive on this planet. It's going to end. So my main concerns that I have, that I want something to be done about for sure, it needs to be stopped. The sex trafficking, the human trafficking, the child endangerment, things of that need to really be stopped. And there needs to be like commissions like yourself. The commissions, to be on a commission and then, approve things or okay things because of being allowed to develop certain programs that encourage that or make things like that happen, something definitely should be done about that. People that are profiting off of other people's sorrow and pain and suffering should definitely not be allowed to be on these commissions or any type of mentoring or Many of these medical, even in the schools, research on kids, people, the elderly, wellness homes, things like that. I had a lot that I really wanted to say and talk about. You know, as usual, it's very difficult for me in my living situation, you know. But I can't stand seeing it anymore. It's killing me, it's killing them, it's killing all of us who are good, loving people, and, you know, who have worked hard for their jobs. And what it's done to our youth, you know, there should be a lot of them that should be released from where they're at because of the situation that they've been put in to cover up for other crimes that have happened. As far as declaring all this a public necessity and the public safety, all that, which is, I guess, why you know, this is escalated. It's to keep things quiet and to not let anybody know what's really going on. And that all, I mean, there's weapons that are just unreal that are being used out there. And now going to court and going to things like that, it seems like it's twisted back to make sure they're safe. The people that are doing the things are safe and can keep doing what they're doing. There were some things that I wanted to talk about with appeals. I don't know if you guys do certain appeals or whatever here.
Ma'am, first of all, I just want to say thank you. We can all hear the passion in your heart and the
Well, I've been doing
concern.
this for years. I've been up here, and I've been totally dismissed. I've been told, you know, my job, my work, you know, because I wanted to cover up what's going on, you know, at the schools. And everywhere I go, I mean, my dog was hit and killed, my kids are hurting, you know, been in
Gotcha.
accidents, you know, you don't do what they want you to do, you know, you run off the road, you get, I mean, now they got the electronic stuff, you know, that's pretty bad.
Tell you what, because we've run out of time.
Always.
But we do want to say that we hear you. There are some commissions that would probably address what your concerns are.
Well, this whole
probably-
community thing, you know, too, it's another deal.
Right, but there are some commissions like the Criminal Justice Commission.
Or the criminals.
That would be appropriate.
No,
But
there's
I tell
no
you
God,
what-
there's only Satan.
I tell you what, let's talk afterwards and see what we can do to address some of these things. We can't solve all the problems. We can't.
We
would be
probably
nice, but-
could, yeah, probably could pretty easily.
Okay, so let's
Just by,
talk
you know,
afterwards if you.
If people were allowed to speak and tell their stories and be able to come up and say, you know, what's going on, or somebody just, you know, needs to be gone.
Thank you very much for your time today. We appreciate you talking and getting that off your chest.
Yeah, I know how it goes. I know. Believe me, I've been arrested enough times for getting up here.
Move to adjourn?
Okay, this meeting is, I second the motion. This meeting is adjourned to Thursday, May 4th at 5 p.m. in City Hall chambers.